Good morning. Please open your Bibles to Psalm 14. Psalm 14. You'll find the notes for this morning's message in the bulletin. And if you don't have a Bible, you'll find the text in the back of the notes. I'll remind you that we continue a time of studying the Psalms, having come through the end of the first major section of John's Gospel. It took about a year and a half to get through the first 12 chapters, and we'll be diving into the upper room shortly. But I thought it would be good to pause, spend some time in the Psalms, and in particular to study Psalms that we don't naturally gravitate towards. Having gone through about 60 of them already, I went back and realized which ones did I pass over and sort of made myself go through and fill in some of the gaps. And it's been rewarding. Our Psalm this morning is probably not one that gets put on T-shirts or crocheted on walls in plaques. And yet it's an important enough psalm that Psalm 14 and a near identical adaptation of it in Psalm 53 occur twice in the Psalms. This content is so important that God includes it twice, virtually identical. If you compare Psalm 14 to Psalm 53, there's about 6 points of difference. It's an adaptation of this psalm. And so we'll read this, and we'll study this, and I think there's good food for us here. This is God's songbook that he's given to his people, to Israel first, now to his church. So let's begin by reading Psalm 14. It's just 7 verses. We'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll try to see what edifying and good truth there is here. Psalm 14 of David. The fool says in his heart, "There is no God." They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge, all evildoers, who eat up my people as they eat up bread, and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. Lord God, I pray that you would not allow anyone here this morning to speak to their own heart the way the fool does, saying there is no God, that we would understand the source of evil, its consequence, its judgment, its self-defeating nature, and that we would be among the generation of the righteous, that we would be among those who call on you and seek for you and look for your salvation to come from Zion. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to look at this psalm in three parts. Part 1, the folly and the corruption of evildoers in verses 1 to 3. Then the culpability and recompense of evildoers in 4 to 6. And finally, the salvation and gladness of God's people. This is a Davidic psalm. David has written this. And so when we ask, what is the purpose of a song like this? Why would we sing a song where 6/7 of it is talking about people out there? Normally, I don't like preaching about people out there. I think ultimately the Pharisees took that and ran with it. And the danger can be that we just talk about the evil people out there. The bad people, the Canaanites out there, really, really bad, and God's going to get them, don't you worry. And there's a sort of self-congratulatory, self-righteous pride that can come from that. And so normally, I don't like preaching that way, teaching that way, but Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 and other passages serves to instruct us. God would have us understand. David, writing for Israel, would have them understand how it is that the nations around them have come to rebel against God, how it is that the evil around them exists. If you look at the evil around us, and there's evil just about everywhere you can look, this psalm helps to explain it, to understand evil. Not so that we can self-righteously sit in judgment on it, God will judge, but so that we can identify it in our own hearts, that we can turn from it, that we can see there are two paths. There is hoping and trusting in God, and there is hoping and trusting in our own strength. And Psalm 14 gives us that instruction. So what is the nature of evil? How does it exist? How is it that people do what they do? And so we begin by looking at the folly and corruption of evildoers. Now, if you look at the first 3 verses, I suggest you can divide it up this way. In verse 1, we have David's evaluation. David will tell us what he thinks of evildoers, which ends with his summary, there's none who does good. And then in verses 2 and 3, the Lord looks down from heaven, he gives his summary, and it's identical with David's. There is none who does good. So David's summary, then the Lord's perspective, and they are one perspective. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, the movement is from what they say to who they are and what they do. And this is important because the Bible assumes the causality flow is as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. I had a professor who used to say, you're not what you think you are, but what you think you are. And so inwardly, inner counsel, inner beliefs, inner thoughts, that is who you are. And from your beliefs and from what you think flow your actions. Our actions are always living out our belief system. And then feelings and emotions flow out of that, lining up as the caboose. I think in many respects our culture has this backwards. We just act on impulse because we feel a certain way. And then we spend a lot of time with our psychologists talking and thinking about it. But biblically, you think, you believe, you interpret. We're all interpreting reality. We're all making sense of reality. We all have theology. Everyone's a theologian. We all believe something about God, even if the thing we believe about God is there is no God. And those beliefs and those thoughts determine who we are on the inside and what we do. And then that will result in the state of our affections and our emotions and experiences. And so David begins with this statement, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, the first thing I want to make clear is when David's talking about the fool, he's talking about the evil fool. We can think of the fool, maybe in some sort of medieval court jester, as something benign, innocent. But biblically, folly is evil. Biblically, folly is what is bound up in the heart of a child that requires discipline to get out. Biblically, folly is wicked. It's godless. So we get, for instance, Proverbs 10:23. Doing wrong is like a joke to a fool, but wisdom is pleasure to a man of understanding. So when the Bible speaks of the fool, it's clear the fool spoken of in verse 1 is the evildoer spoken of in verse 4, right? So we're not talking about some neutral category of folly or simply someone who's uninformed, someone who lacks information. That's kind of the whole point, is this statement is not morally neutral. What they say, the fool says there is no God. So he says it in his heart. What's the significance of that? Well, Psalm 14 is placed here, and it builds upon things said earlier. If you turn back to Psalm 10, we get some similar statements that I think will help shed some light on the significance of what it is this fool is saying in his heart. Psalm 10 begins, why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? And then he begins to describe the wicked. In arrogance, the wicked hotly pursue the poor. Let them be caught in the schemes that they have devised. For the wicked boasts of the desires of his soul, and the one greedy for gain curses and renounces God. In the pride of his face, the wicked does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. His way prospers at all times. Your judgments are on high out of his sight. For all of his foes, he puffs at them. He says in his heart, I shall not be moved, though all generations shall not meet adversity. His mouth is filled with cursing, and deceit and oppression are under his tongue. Mischief and iniquity. He sits in ambush in the villages, in the hiding places. He murders the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. He lurks in ambush like a lion in his thicket. He lurks that he may seize the poor. He seizes the poor when he draws him into his net. The helpless are crushed, sink down, and fall by his might. He says in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. Arise, O Lord, O God, lift up your hand. Forget not the afflicted. Why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, you will not call to account? Do you see the similarity? This is, Psalm 14 comes after Psalm 10. I think this is helping inform what he's saying. And the fact that he's saying it inwardly to me suggests he's reassuring himself. He reassures himself in his heart. And what is he's reassuring of himself is, I think, the following. There's no judge. God does not see. These are the things that are said in his heart in Psalm 10. I shall not be moved. In other words, most people committing and committed to doing evil don't quite have the courage to acknowledge, I am warring with God. And so they flatter themselves and they tell themselves, there will be no judgment. God does not see. God does not exist. There are no absolute standards. I can do as I please. In other words, what David is saying is this belief system, atheism, is not something that's arrived at honestly. Rather, it's wish fulfillment. Sometimes people accuse Christianity of being wish fulfillment. But to be able to live as you please, to do what you want, and have no consequences, no judgment, that is the ultimate wish fulfillment. Charles Spurgeon says this, ironically, there are no atheists anywhere but on earth. There are none in heaven, and there are none in hell. Atheism is a strange thing. Even the devils never fell into that vice, for the devils believe and tremble. David is explaining that the root of evil, the root of the oppression around him, the root of the wicked nations that raise their fist at God, is rooted in a denial of God. A denial of the God of the Bible. Saying there is no God is something they tell themselves, but of course they have a vested interest in saying this. And it's not an honest mistake. Here's your next blank. It's not innocent, but willful rebellion. Willful rebellion. Not innocent, but a willful rebel. Turn to Psalm 19. There are some things that theologians can refer to as natural or common revelation, natural revelation. And these are things that everyone knows. There's a certain amount of truth that God has determined everyone will know. Paul makes a point of this in Romans 2. Everyone knows basically right and wrong. Everyone has a conscience that either condemns or acquits them. Well, one of the other things that everyone knows is there is a God. Psalm 19 makes this point clearly. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them is set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber. Like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from one end of the heavens, and its circle to the end of them. And there is nothing hidden from its heat. Biblically, I am an theist. I don't believe in atheists. And I don't say that to try to be cute. What I mean is the Bible insists that everyone has this knowledge. Now, the Bible equally insists that they attempt to deceive themselves. They tell themselves there's no God. They tell themselves there's no God. Romans 1 speaks of it as suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. But understand there will be no one. There will be no one who stands before the living God and says, I didn't know you existed. I did not know you were there. No one. It is a foolish hope to think that will escape trouble. It is, as I sometimes say, a cardboard bomb shelter. Everyone knows about God. And so to deny God's existence is folly. There are no there's no legitimately held skepticisms. There are no legitimate intellectual challenges. Oh, there can be questions about how to make sense of it all. But that there is a God, that he's glorious, this is something everyone knows. It's not even just something everyone can know. Biblically, the insistence is they do know. Let me read to you what Paul says in Romans 1, just making this point with absolute clarity. And similarly, in Romans 1, Paul shows that the root of the tree that bears so much evil fruit in the world is the suppression of the knowledge of God. I won't read it all, but Romans 1 ends with a list of 21 different vices, and that's just a sampling of the evil men can do. And Paul tracks that evil all the way back to the cords of the wall. And what is it rooted in? It's rooted in this. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. What truth is that, Paul? For what can be known about God is plain to them. Paul is not talking about potential knowledge. He's not talking about the possibility of knowing things. Paul is making a much bigger claim. He is talking about what people know, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. Get this, so they are without excuse. Any attempt to excuse judgment by saying, I did not know, there is no excuse, Paul says emphatically. They are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile. And then Paul begins the development from the suppression of that truth to the outworking of wickedness and evil. It's the same logic of Psalm 14. So understand, first of all, that the root of evil and the godless around us, the root is the willful suppression of the truth of the God who is. And the repeating like a mantra to oneself, there's no God, there's no judgment, there's no recompense. I will get away with it. No one sees. So we see over and over again in Psalm 10. Now, that can be encouraging when you witness and you evangelize, because you'll meet people who say they don't believe in God. And when you speak to them, they may well have convinced themselves. But I guarantee you, when they lie awake at night and can't sleep at 3 a.m, there are times when that suppression of truth slips. I once heard a pastor speak about that analogy in Romans 1 as though someone's in a large box, a chest in the attic with a flashlight, and they're trying to get out, and someone else is trying to keep them in, and they're keeping that lid down. But every now and then the lid cracks up a bit and some light shoots out. That's kind of the way unbelievers are living. And so when you talk to your unbelieving friend, your unbelieving family member, coworker, understand they know deep down there is the living God. And it is folly that says there is not. David insists that. The fool says, he's reassuring himself, he's not innocent. Rather, he is a willful rebel. He is a willful rebel. Now we go from their belief system, we go from their dogma to what they are, from what they say to what they are and what they do. And David insists that they are inwardly rotten and outwardly abominable. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. So this belief, this denial of the God who is, this foolish belief, leads to inward corruption. We can't believe evil things without doing evil things. The contamination spreads. One commentator writes this way, James Hamilton: David's assessment is undiplomatic and unsympathetic. David makes no attempt here to justify the wicked, no attempt to suggest that the people of God share some responsibility for the way the wicked have rejected God, and no attempt to soften words of condemnation directed at those who set themselves against Yahweh. The psalm starts with what the fool thinks to himself. And this leads naturally to what the fool does. And there is nothing good in it. The fool despoils and does abominable deeds, prompting the assertion that no one who thinks this way does good. End quote. And that is entirely accurate. They're not innocent, and that theology of God corrupts them. The language of rotting or spoiling inwardly. Inwardly, they're rotten, and that leads to abominable deeds. The root of all evil actions are evil beliefs. Always. It's why I'll say that when we sin, we're living out unbelief. When we sin, we believe a lie. When I speak angrily or harshly to my wife, in that moment, I'm believing a lie. I'm certainly not believing the truth in that moment. We always live out our belief system, and so our beliefs always undergird our actions. So the beliefs of the wicked will undergird their actions. That's the point. Which leads David to conclude, there is none who does good. Now, obviously, the none here in Psalm 14 is relative, because over against the wicked and the Lord looking down on the children of man, we have also the generation of the righteous in verse 5. So in David's mind, there are two camps. There's the sons of men, the sons of Adam. There's the generation of the righteous. But what completely summarizes one camp is there is none who does good. And that can be challenging to us as well, because don't we think we see and know unbelievers, people who have other religions, who do things that look good? Atheist firefighters risking their lives to rescue children. Acts of kindness, charity committed by Muslims, committed by Mormons, committed by many different religions. How can David say there's none who does good? Well, that's because good is defined by God and is directed to him. For something to be good, it has to meet two standards. First, it has to be in keeping with God's character and his law. Good has to image God. But secondly, good has to be done for the right reason, for God's glory. And that is the condition the unbeliever never meets. So unbelievers or people in other faiths can do things consistent with God's character and law. An unbeliever can be heroic, selfless. They can risk their life for their friend, but they don't do it for the right reason. And that does not please God. Any more than, I'll give you an analogy. Imagine Serena and I go shopping and are foolish enough to leave all of our children home. My mother's not there. They're home alone. And while we're gone, they decide to change the locks and set up a kingdom and deny the existence of the parents. There are no parents. They tell themselves, there is no parent. And we come home and we're locked out, and we look through the window to see how they're conducting themselves in their new kingdom. And they're rebels. They know perfectly well they're parents, but they keep telling themselves there are no parents. And we discover that the way they conduct themselves has some similarities with the way we conducted things. Abner has wisely made a rule forbidding the children playing with matches. Am I pleased? They're keeping my rule. I have a rule, you can't play with matches. They have a rule, you can't play with matches. Does that honor me? No, because the entire thing is done in an umbrella of rebellion, right? In order for me to be pleased with my children, I want them striving to honor their mother and father, to do the things I would have them do. If they say, you are not my father, I have no parent, I recognize no authority, and then they do some things that I would have liked them to do anyway, it doesn't honor me, it doesn't please me. And in the same way, the man who looks and sees the evidence of God all around him in creation and says, there is no God, I'll do as I please, there's no judgment, and then the things he pleases happen to line up with the things God requires, does not please God. It's less angering. I mean, I'm glad when unbelievers act rightly, and it frequently is nicer for the people around them. But it does not please God. This is why Hebrews 11 says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. So good has to be done in keeping with God's character and for God's glory. Otherwise, good is being done for idolatry. And we get this as well. When someone gives a large donation, but they just do it to get a tax credit. Or somebody who helps an old lady across the street because they're hoping the woman would watch him and be impressed. As soon as we know that's why someone's doing something, all of a sudden the virtue of their actions shrivels up, does it not? We get that intuitively. And so here David can say there's none who does good. That leads us then to the Lord's evaluation. The Lord's evaluation of the sons of man. Let's read verses 2 and 3. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understands, who seeks after God. They have all turned aside, together they've become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Lord's evaluation of the sons of man. Now, the way David frames this in verse 2 is the Lord looks down from heaven. And this is familiar language. The Tower of Babel. is spoken of this way. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. The Lord said, let us come down there and confuse their language. The picture is that man is looking around and saying, there is no God. But God in heaven looks down. And just as he looked down to come down and judge at Babel, just as the response in Psalm 2, remember the two Psalms that head up the book of Psalms, laying out the two major themes, the path of wisdom and the path of folly in Psalm 1, Psalm 2, the Messiah king who will crush his enemies. The response in Psalm 2, turn to Psalm 2. The response in Psalm 2 to a global conspiracy to fight Yahweh and his Christ, his anointed, his Messiah. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves. The rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. And he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. This is the same movement. There's wicked men, and they've become inwardly corrupt through their denial of God's existence, and they do not do good. But God in heaven looks down, and he's looking down here. He evaluates for judgment. He evaluates for judgment. This is the same movement we saw last week in Psalm 11. Remember? If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of man. God from heaven sees all, and he sees all with righteous judgment and evaluation. Nothing escapes his sight. The fool may say God will not see, but he sees. He sees perfectly and plainly. And so God here is testing. He's evaluating what sort of people are on the earth. And it's described negatively and positively. First with what they do not do and what they do. The Lord looks down on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. In the conclusion, they've all turned aside. They've become utterly corrupt. So what would God have them do? What they don't do is understand or seek for God. Understand or seek for God. Now here is an implied offer of grace and mercy. This is building back, go back to Psalm 2 again. We're going to be going back to Psalm 2 a couple of times. This is building off of themes in Psalm 2. Even as the nations rage and even as God from heaven laughs, at the end of Psalm 2 in the final stanza, an offer of pardon and forgiveness is extended. Read verses 10 and 12. This is the words get picked up here. Now therefore, O kings, be wise or have understanding. This is part of the same word family from the Hebrew word in Psalm 14. See if any who have understanding. Be wise, O kings. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. If they had wisdom, if they had understanding, what would these rebels do? These people who've been plotting against God. They'd serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Psalm 2 ends with an implicit invitation to God's enemies and rebels. Kings who've been plotting against him, if they will rejoice with trembling, if they will kiss the Son, if they will take refuge in God, they will find a blessing and not a curse and not judgment. So God is looking down from heaven here to see, is anyone doing this? Is anyone responding to my offer of pardon? Is anyone turning to me to seek shelter in me? To see if there are any who understands, who seek after God. But they don't. They don't. What do? They've turned aside. Together they've become corrupt. And then he echoes David's conclusion. There is none who does good. And then he adds, not even one. So what do? They completely abandon God's rule. This language of turning aside is used in Deuteronomy chapter 9 with the golden calf. The Lord tells Moses, the Lord said to me, Moses writes, arise, go down quickly from here, for your people whom you have brought from Egypt have acted corruptly. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a metal image. So the picture is God would have us walk and conduct ourselves a certain way. And he's given us a conscience to indicate, give us information. He's given us his word. But these people, the sons of man, who have not sought him, who have not shown the wisdom to seek refuge in the Son, instead they turn aside. They do what they please. And in doing so, become corrupt. Which brings to the summary conclusion: there is none who does good, not even one. Now that insistence of not even one is interesting. That echoes the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember when Abraham is interceding for the two cities on the plain? Lord, would you spare it for 100 righteous? I would spare it for 100 righteous. Would you spare it for 90? And Abraham clearly is not very hopeful that there'll be that many people, because he keeps whittling it down and finally gets to 10. Would you save it for 10? I would save it for 10. Here, there is none righteous. No, not one. We're not just talking about two cities now. We're talking about everyone outside of the generation of the righteous, everyone outside of the people of God. And there is none who does good, not even one. And the implication is therefore, how deserving is judgment? How deserving is judgment? This also makes it clear again, there's only two positions you can be in. You can be in the sons of men, who in various ways say there is no God, or they refashion God into their own image and likeness, because it's clear that these are people who should be calling out to God, that verse 4 makes clear. And there are those who are calling out to God, who are part of the generation of the righteous. David, I'll read James Hamilton again. For David, there are no neutral places, no intermediate alternatives between devotion to Yahweh and rebellion against him. There is no in between. There is only wisdom and folly, obedience and rebellion, boasting in the Lord, or, as Psalm 10:3 says, boasting in one's sinful desires. Anyone who rejects Yahweh is a fool, and those who reject Yahweh cause the world to be ruined. They commit abominations, and they do nothing good. So David is telling Israel, we are being instructed that there is no possible way to remain good and deny God. We can't have modern liberal religion where we cut out the eternal claims and we cut out the God and we just keep the Sermon on the Mount and we love people. It will corrupt. It will rot from within. There is none who does good, not even one. Which brings us then to the culpability and recompense of evildoers. That's the declaration. Because of the refusal to acknowledge God, the refusal to believe in God, the constant self-reassurance, there is no God, there is no judgment, I'm going to get away with it, no one sees, nothing will happen, it'll be okay. They inwardly corrupt, they outwardly do all manner of evil. They don't call on God, they don't seek him, they don't take shelter in him. So now we see it spread to others. The culpability and recompense of evildoers, verses 4-6. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. So now we consider their willful ignorance and great guilt. Their willful ignorance and great guilt. And David asks the question, have they no knowledge? Now we've already seen that the Lord searched, do they have any understanding? Do they have any knowledge? And this is highlighting again the self-defeating nature of evil. I've said before, if there is no God, then as Paul says, let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. If there is no God, then get as much as you can, do what you want, be the authentic you. Have no doubt Hitler was being the authentic Hitler. Our slogans can be dangerous. You do you. Even the Unabomber, you do you. But if there is a God, how foolish is it to live that way? Have they no knowledge, all evildoers, who eat up my people as they eat bread? And here we're starting to see the evil doesn't just corrupt oneself and spread, but it harms the righteous. And the picture here is of someone casually devouring the Lord's people, casually devouring the Lord's people. David in Psalm 27 uses a similar word picture. When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and my foes, it is they who stumble. Proverbs 30, verse 14. There are those whose teeth are swords, whose fangs are knives, to devour the poor from the earth, the needy from among mankind. It's not bad enough, then, that the atheist, the unbeliever, denies God, inwardly corrupts, but they do harm to others. That's what David has in view. And of course, from Israel's vantage point, the Philistines, they oppressed them. All of Israel's nations surrounding, in some sense, were their enemies. And so these godless people that David has in mind around them, not only do they bring on great guilt upon themselves, but they do great harm to others. And it's casual. I mean, that's the picture here. It's just you wouldn't think much. We're going to have a luncheon afterwards, and you're going to go through a line, and these are not going to be weighty, heavy decisions for you to grab a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you're just going to take what you want. It's not a big thing. You're not going to sit there and like, I've been preparing for this luncheon for 2 weeks. No, it's a casual, light thing. Yeah, will I grab a roll? Maybe I'll grab a roll. Well, if I bite of that, perhaps. These people get to the point where they devour God's people as they eat bread. They devour God's people. And notice, again, even this far into the psalm, the implicit offer of grace. They stubbornly reject the Lord's grace. Part of what's vexing is they do not call upon the Lord. And by implication, they could, even at this state in their corruption, they could call upon the Lord. And the Psalms have told us what happens when you call upon the Lord. Psalm 3, verse 4, I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered. Psalm 4, verse 1, answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. And then verse 3, the Lord hears when I call to him. In fact, we know from Romans 10, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Again, written into this psalm that sounds so judgmental is implicit invitations to repentance and faith, invitations to salvation. Why don't you call on the Lord instead of devouring his people as bread? And implicitly, clearly, even these who are doing this, if they will call on the Lord, will be saved. The tragedy is both what they do and what they don't do. Have they no knowledge, all evildoers who eat my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. They do not call upon the name of the Lord. Well, now finally, we go from their thoughts and their actions now to finally their feelings. This way of living and thinking will ultimately lead to terror, their great terror. And even as they deny God, that denial will only last for so long. For some, in God's grace, that terror will come in this life. That's what happened to me. That's how the Lord brought me to faith. I had a very nominal profession of faith. I believed in some God that I'd heard about as a kid. It had nothing to do with how I lived. My deeds were vile, all of that. I flattered myself, I'll get away with this. And then one day, the Lord began to put his thumb down on me, and I began to grow more and more afraid of standing before him. So would that terror would come upon God's enemies now. It's not entirely clear in the psalm when they are in great terror. The day of judgment, and it's too late then. Hopefully now. There they are in great terror. Why? Because notice the location. They've said there is no God, but as they draw near to attack God's people, they're drawing near to God. Not in a good way. For God is with the generation of the righteous. Well, if they've been trying to eat the generation of the righteous like bread, then what are they doing? They're inadvertently drawing near to God. How does God feel about those who would touch the apple of his eye? How do you feel when someone tries to poke you in the eye? That's the implication. the location. God is with the generation of the righteous and also his opposition. They're in terror because the very people they're trying to eat and devour, God is with. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. And again, this is building off of Psalm 2. What's the final word of advice to the kings and rulers of the world who've conspired to battle the living God? Blessed are all who take refuge in him. And who's the him? The Son, whose wrath is kindled quickly, who has been given a rod of iron with which to dash the nations like a potter's vessel. Well, they've refused to draw near to God. But who has drawn near to God? The people they're going after. And so they will be in terror when they realize that the Lord is their refuge. There are some who've heeded that call, and the Lord defends them. Now, this is the ultimate judgment. And part of saying this, David is giving encouragement to those who are so oppressed. If you're part of the generation of the righteous, if you're part of these poor who are being devoured, you can know God is with you. And you can know that the promise that there's a blessing for those who take refuge in him is sure. And that all those enemies will be struck with great terror. Hopefully now and in this life, in a sorrow that leads to repentance and life without regret. Or finally on the final day. Because, of course, there will be no atheists in the final judgment. As Spurgeon said, there'll be no atheists in hell. Would that there be no atheists now. Verse 7 brings us to the prayer, salvation and gladness for God's people. But before we get there, I want to make another point. David is writing, assuming an us-them dichotomy. It's clear, right? There's the generation of the righteous, there's God's people, there's the nation of Israel, there's their king, David. They're in a right relationship with God, and there's everyone else. And the temptation for us is to think it's that cut and dry for us as well. That, of course, we're the good people. Of course, we're on the inside. But turn to Romans 3. One of the reasons why Psalm 14 is so worth studying is it gets quoted in Romans. And Paul's application in Romans is pretty striking. Paul insists that the summary statements made by David and by the Lord are not just true of the heathen, they're true of religious Jews. In fact, they were true of all of us at one point. As Paul is trying to demonstrate in Romans why it is we need forgiveness in Jesus Christ, why it is we need the Messiah to be crucified on our behalf so that we can become forgiven. After condemning the pagan in chapter 1 who suppresses the truth, the moralist in chapter 2, he gets to the religious person in chapter 3, and now he's tying it all together, and he does it with a pastiche of psalm citations. See if you can recognize some of them. Verse 9. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written. None is righteous, no, not one. What on earth are you talking about, Paul? You're citing Psalm 14. That's about those guys out there. The Philistines, the Canaanites, and the Amorites, and the Hittites. That's not us. Oh, yeah, it is. Outside of Christ, that is every one of us. That's how we came into this world. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they've become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Then he quotes from some other Psalms. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues for deceit. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. In the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Paul says, summing up Jew and Greek alike. Summing up every one of us outside of Christ. Now we know whatever the law speaks, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight. So what we learn in Romans 3 is this summary and this guilt and this folly is in every one of us as we come into this world. It's in every one of my children. We all came into this world, Paul says in Ephesians 2, we're by nature children of wrath. This is the factory setting of the sons of Adam and the sons of man. So even as David is speaking to the Lord's people and helping explain those people out there, you and I at least were once out there. And when we sin and think, God will forgive, it'll be okay, the Lord won't see. He's so gracious that way. That same lie and that same folly is at work in our hearts, is it not? When we make the same boasts, God has forgotten. He's hidden his face. He will never see it. He will not call it into account. I shall not be moved. Are all variations of saying there is no God. And so Psalm 14 becomes a bit more practical for us. It's not just about the pagans out there. Verse 7, the praise and the hope, the salvation and gladness of God's people. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. What we have here is a messianic prayer and an anticipated joy. A messianic prayer and an anticipated joy. Israel has often been the underdog in the region. There are some high points of prominence under David and Solomon. For most of their existence in the land, they were picked on, oppressed by their neighbors. That's the way it is today as well. And so David, explaining the evil around them in his day, cries out and would have us cry out to God as well. And notice where they're looking at salvation coming from. It's not, oh, that salvation would come from Washington, D.C. If you watch the presidential debate, you can have no doubt such a hope is false. I don't care who you're voting for. No, the salvation is coming from Zion. But what's the significance of Zion? Turn back one more time to Psalm 2. What is God's counter move? What is his response to the global cabal of evil nations and kings trying to fight him off? What does he do that should take care of things? He laughs. And then in verse 5 and 6, he shall speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. That's the move of Psalm 2. We got this global conspiracy of the nations. The Lord's response is, I've established my king in Zion. Now you guys would be well advised to bend the knee, kiss the Son, rejoice with trembling, take refuge in him, or he's going to smash you to bits. In other words, God's response is his Messiah, his Son, and his King that he has installed on Mount Zion. So in Psalm 14:7, oh, that salvation would come for Israel from Zion. We know what that salvation is. It's the Messiah. It's the Lord's Son. It's the Lord's King. Now, when David writes this, I'm not sure how much he's put all that together, but we know with absolute certainty who that is, what that is. Isaiah 59, verses 20 to 21 says the following, a Redeemer will come from Zion to those in Jacob who turn from transgression, declares the Lord. And of course, Paul quotes that in Romans 11. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, and he will banish ungodliness from Jacob. In other words, in David's day, as he lamented the evil going on around him, the injustice and the oppression, the poor being eaten like bread, his hope and his cry is that a deliverer would come from Zion. And I suggest to you today that should be our hope as well. By all means, vote for righteous laws, vote for righteous leaders, and hope in nothing but the deliverance that will come from Zion, from the Messiah. Because when he returns to earth, according to Zechariah, remember in Zechariah, in our study way back a decade ago, Israel's surrounded by her enemies. And on that day is coming from the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, the houses plundered, the women raped. Half the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem to the east. When Jesus ascended into heaven, where on planet Earth did he ascend from? Mount of Olives. What did the angels say? He shall return in the same manner as he ascended. Touchdown for the returning Lord Jesus on planet Earth is the Mount of Olives. A deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness. That's David's hope. That's Israel's hope. That's our hope. That is what will set things straight. That is what will deal with the wicked. That is what will put them in terror, such that the kings of the earth hide in caves and cry out that they would fall upon them to hide them from the face and the wrath of the Lamb. Messianic prayer, oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. And with that, an anticipated joy. And this is what we hold on to. This is what we hold fast to. The joy that will be ours when the Lord restores the fortunes of his people. Let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. That's the joy that's expected. This is speaking of a future national restoration of Israel. It is. Psalm 81 speaks of it this way. You were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You covered all their sins, Selah. Jeremiah 30, 18 to 19. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will restore the fortunes of the tents of Jacob and have compassion on his dwellings. The city shall be rebuilt on its mound. The palace shall stand where it used to be. Out of them shall come songs of thanksgiving and voices of those who celebrate. I will multiply them, and they shall not be few. I will make them honored, and they shall not be small. So again, to summarize, as we prepare to break for our ABFs, the root of all evil in the world is the foolish, wicked denial of God. It tracks back to theology. Theology, bad theology, is the root of all evil in the world. Even as early as the serpent's lie, you'll be like God, you won't die. And they believed that. And it spreads. The refusal to honor God will result in great evil and wickedness. That will spread ultimately. Don't be surprised when the righteous are persecuted, devoured like bread. But also remember that this is the way we came into this world, that folly, that wicked denial may still be in our hearts. Also know that the invitation to seek God, to call on God, to find refuge in God is open even now to his worst enemies. It's implicit in this psalm. Why don't they seek him? Why don't they call on him? And then finally, the only hope that we have, that we should have, is not in horses from Egypt, a deliverer from D.C., the passing of legislation X. Ultimately, our hope and our joy and our expectation of praise is rooted in the return of the Lord Jesus Christ, a deliverer coming from Zion who will make things right. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. You are dismissed.